The knife in Ren's hand shook as she cut through the rope holding the meat sack. Her fingers were numb from cold, and her stomach twisted so hard she almost cried out. She had not eaten in 3 days. The smell of dried venison from the storehouse was the only thing keeping her legs moving. She glanced over her shoulder. The training grounds of the Blackthorn pack stretched behind her, empty in the pale hour before sunrise. Guards usually walked this path every 20 minutes. She had counted the pattern for 2 nights before she dared to come close enough to touch the storehouse wall. Ren was not supposed to be anywhere near this land. She had no pack mark, no protection, and no name that meant anything to the wolves who ruled this territory. She was an Omega without a home, and Omegas without homes did not last long in the wild borderlands between packs. Her hands finally broke through the rope. She grabbed 2 strips of dried meat and shoved them into the torn pocket of her coat. Her whole body wanted to run, but she forced herself to move slowly, quietly, the way she had learned to move when she still had a family who taught her how to survive. That family was gone now. She did not let herself think about them. Thinking about them made her chest hurt worse than her empty stomach. She turned to leave and froze. A tall man stood between her and the tree line, arms crossed, golden eyes catching the little light of dawn. He wore no crown, no obvious mark of rank, but something about the way he stood told her immediately that he was not a normal guard. His presence pressed against her skin like a weight. "That storehouse holds enough meat to feed 40 wolves through winter," he said, his voice calm, almost curious. "And you took 2 strips." Ren's heart slammed against her ribs. She had heard stories about the Blackthorn territory. She had heard about their guard captain, a wolf named Halden who could track a scent for miles. She had never heard a warning about someone with eyes like liquid gold. She said nothing. Running was pointless. She had seen enough starving Omegas caught by pack guards to know how these moments usually ended. "I am not going to hurt you," the man said, though his tone did nothing to convince her. His eyes moved over her thin frame, her cracked lips, the way her hands trembled even now that she stood still. Something shifted in his expression, though she could not read what it meant. Footsteps thundered behind her. Ren spun to see a broad-shouldered man with a scar over his eyebrow closing the distance fast. This had to be Halden. His nostrils flared as he caught her scent, and his lips curled back. "Found her creeping near the west fence," Halden said, though his eyes never left Ren. "Unclaimed. No pack scent on her at all. Thief." "I saw," the golden-eyed man said quietly. Ren's knees nearly gave out. She had heard what packs did to thieves who had no pack to protect them. She braced herself, waiting for hands to grab her arms, waiting for pain, waiting for the punishment she had always known was coming the moment she decided to steal. Instead, the man stepped closer, and Halden immediately lowered his head in respect. "Alpha," Halden said. The word hit Ren like cold water. This was not a guard. This was the Alpha King himself, Ronan Blackthorn, ruler of one of the strongest packs in the Northern Territories. She had stolen food from the storehouse of a king. Her stomach dropped even further than her hunger had already taken it. "Please," she whispered, the word slipping out before she could stop it. She hated how weak she sounded, how her voice cracked on a single syllable. "I did not mean any disrespect. I was hungry. I will pay it back. I will do anything." Ronan studied her for a long moment. Something about her scent confused him, tangled with fear and exhaustion, but underneath it, something clean and unclaimed, something that made the wolf inside him go strangely still. "Bring her to the hall," Ronan said finally. Halden's eyebrows lifted in surprise, but he did not argue. He grabbed Ren's arm, not roughly, but firmly enough that escape was impossible. She stumbled forward, her mind spinning with fear of what waited for her inside that hall. The great hall of the Blackthorn pack was larger than any building Ren had ever stood inside. Stone walls rose high above her, hung with banners marked with a wolf's head and silver thread. Advisors and pack members gathered in small clusters, whispering the moment she was dragged through the doors. "An Omega," someone murmured, "caught stealing from the storehouse." "She has no pack scent," another voice added. "A stray." Ren kept her eyes on the floor, refusing to let them see how much their words cut into her. She had heard variations of the same insults for months. Stray, thief, nothing. She had told herself none of it mattered anymore, but standing in front of an entire pack, it was hard to hold on to that belief. Ronan walked to the front of the hall and took his seat on a wide wooden throne carved with wolves chasing each other in an endless circle. Halden pushed Ren forward until she stood only a few steps from the throne. "Alpha," said an older man with gray at his temples, stepping forward from the crowd. Ren would later learn his name was Garrick, one of Ronan's most trusted advisors. "The punishment for theft against the pack storehouse is clear. Exile at minimum. Worse for an unclaimed Omega with no pack to answer for her. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the hall. Ren's whole body went cold. Exile meant returning to the wilderness with nothing, and she was already barely surviving out there. Worse punishments were things she refused to imagine. Ronan raised a hand, and the murmuring stopped instantly. "How long since you last ate a full meal?" he asked, looking directly at Ren. The question caught her off guard. She blinked, unsure how to answer a king who was supposed to be deciding her punishment, not asking about her hunger. "I do not remember," she admitted quietly. "Do you have a pack?" he asked next. "No," she said. The word came out smaller than she intended. "Family?" Her throat tightened. She shook her head, unable to force out an answer. Ronan leaned back slightly, his golden eyes never leaving her face. The hall stayed silent, waiting for his judgment. Ren could feel every eye on her, weighing her, already deciding she deserved whatever punishment was coming. "She stole 2 strips of dried meat," Ronan said finally, his voice carrying easily through the hall. "Not gold, not weapons. Food, because she was starving." "Alpha, the law does not separate types of theft," Garrick said carefully. "If we let this pass without consequence, others may believe our storehouses are unprotected." "I did not say there would be no consequence," Ronan replied. His eyes moved back to Ren, studying her the way a man studies something he does not fully understand yet. But exile for a starving Omega with nowhere to go is not justice. It is a slower version of the same theft she already suffers from the world. Ren's breath caught. She had expected cruelty. She had expected pain. She had never expected an Alpha King to speak about her suffering as though it mattered to him. "What is your name?" Ronan asked. "Ren," she answered, barely above a whisper. "Ren," he repeated, testing the name as though committing it to memory. "You will not be exiled. You will not be punished with pain. Instead, you will work within this pack's household until your debt to the storehouse is repaid. You will have food, a place to sleep, and protection from anyone who tries to harm you while you remain under my roof." Shock rippled through the hall louder than before. Halden's grip on her arm loosened in surprise. Garrick opened his mouth to protest, then closed it again, clearly recognizing the finality in his Alpha's tone. Ren stared at Ronan, unable to process what she had just heard. Kings did not show mercy to strays. Packs did not open their doors to Omegas who belonged to no one. Every instinct she had built over months of survival told her this was some kind of trick, a cruelty wrapped in kindness that would reveal its true shape later. "Why?" The word slipped out before she could stop herself. It was not the question of someone grateful. It was the question of someone who had been hurt too many times to trust an act of kindness without reason. The hall went utterly silent. No one questioned an Alpha's decision, especially not the person receiving mercy instead of punishment. Ronan did not look angry at her boldness. If anything, something like respect flickered across his expression. "Because starving does not deserve punishment," he said simply. "It deserves food." Halden released her arm completely now, though he stayed close, his eyes still wary. Ren stood frozen in the middle of the hall, unsure whether to feel relief or deeper suspicion. Kindness from strangers had never come without a price in her experience. She had learned that lesson too many times to forget it now. "She will stay in the servant quarters near the kitchens," Ronan said, addressing Garrick and the rest of the hall. "Beatrice will see that she is fed and given proper clothing. She will work to repay what she took, nothing more, nothing less." "And if she runs?" Halden asked, his voice edged with doubt. Ronan's gaze returned to Ren, steady and unreadable. "She will not run. She has nowhere else to go." The words stung more than Ren wanted to admit, mostly because they were true. She had nowhere else. No pack, no family, no safety beyond whatever walls this Alpha King decided to offer her. Whether his mercy was real or some strange test she had not yet understood, she had no other choice but to accept it. A woman with kind eyes and silver-streaked hair stepped forward from the crowd. This had to be Beatrice, the healer Ronan had mentioned. She looked Ren over with a critical but not unkind eye, taking note of her thin frame and trembling hands. "Come with me," Beatrice said gently. "Let us get some food into you before you fall over." Ren hesitated, glancing once more at the Alpha King who had just changed the entire direction of her life with a handful of sentences. Ronan watched her without expression, though something in his eyes lingered a moment longer than necessary, as if he too was trying to understand why he had made this decision instead of the one everyone expected of him. "Thank you," Ren said quietly, the words feeling strange and unfamiliar in her mouth after months of silence and survival. Ronan gave a small nod, nothing more, but it was enough to send Ren following Beatrice out of the hall, her legs weak from exhaustion and confusion in equal measure. Behind her, Whispers rose again among the pack members, questioning what had just happened, questioning why their king had shown mercy to a stray with no name and no pack to speak of. Wren did not know the answer either. All she knew was that for the first time in longer than she could remember, she was walking toward a warm meal instead of running from danger. It felt like the beginning of something, though whether that something was safety or a new kind of danger, she could not yet tell. As she stepped through the hall doors into the morning light, she allowed herself one glance back. Ronan still sat on his throne, watching her leave, his expression carved from careful stone, but his eyes told a different story, one that even he did not seem to fully understand yet. Neither of them knew it in that moment, but the 2 strips of stolen meat had changed something far larger than either of their lives alone. The kitchen was warm, filled with the smell of fresh bread and simmering stew, a smell so overwhelming after months of hunger that Wren's eyes stung with tears she refused to let fall. Beatrice guided her to a wooden bench near the fire and placed a bowl in front of her without a word of judgment. "Eat slowly," Beatrice warned. "Your stomach is not used to full meals. Eating too fast will only make you sick." Wren nodded, though every instinct screamed at her to eat as much as possible before someone decided to take it away. She forced herself to take small bites, savoring the warmth spreading through her chest with each spoonful. A young woman with bright eyes and flour dusted across her apron peeked around the kitchen doorway, curiosity written across her face. "Is that the one who stole from the storehouse?" she whispered to another kitchen worker, though not quietly enough to escape Wren's ears. Wren kept her eyes on her bowl, used to being talked about as though she were not present. She had learned long ago that defending herself against whispers rarely changed anyone's opinion. "Ignore them," Beatrice said, noticing the tension in Wren's shoulders. "Curiosity fades quickly in a pack this large. You will not be the center of gossip for long." Wren doubted that, but she appreciated the woman's attempt at comfort. She finished her stew slowly, feeling strength return to her limbs bite by bite, though her mind kept circling back to the strange scene in the hall. An alpha king who chose mercy over punishment. A king who asked about her hunger before deciding her fate. It made no sense against everything she had learned about how the world treated Omegas without packs, yet here she was, warm and fed for the first time in months, all because of his decision. She did not know yet whether to trust it, but as the warmth of the stew settled deep in her stomach, she allowed herself, just for a moment, to hope that maybe this place would be different from everywhere else she had been forced to survive. Beatrice led her afterward to a small room near the servant quarters, simple but clean, with a real bed and a folded set of clothes waiting on top of it. It was more comfort than Wren had known in longer than she could remember, and as she sat on the edge of the bed once Beatrice left her alone, she finally allowed the tears she had been holding back to fall freely, silent and unwitnessed, a release of months of fear finally breaking loose. Outside her window, the Blackthorn territory stretched wide and unfamiliar, full of wolves she did not know and rules she did not yet understand. But for tonight, she had food in her stomach and a roof over her head, and for the first time in a long time, that felt like enough. Somewhere across the compound, in a private study lit by a single lamp, Ronan sat with his hands folded, staring at nothing in particular. Garrick had already come and gone, questioning his decision twice before finally leaving with a warning about the political risks of showing softness toward strays. Ronan had not argued. He did not have an explanation that made sense even to himself. He only knew that the moment he had seen Wren's exhausted eyes staring back at him in the dawn light, something inside him had refused to let Halden drag her away for punishment. It was not pity, though pity had certainly been part of it. It was something else, something unfamiliar, a pull he could not name and did not fully trust. He told himself it meant nothing, that it was simply the natural instinct of an alpha to protect the vulnerable within his territory. But even as he told himself that, some quieter part of his mind whispered that it was not quite the truth. He did not know yet what Wren would come to mean to his pack, to his rule, or to the careful order he had built over years of leadership. All he knew was that letting her stay felt right in a way few decisions in his life ever had, and Ronan Blackthorn was not a man who ignored instincts that ran that deep. Outside, the sun rose fully over the Blackthorn territory, marking the beginning of a day that neither Wren nor Ronan yet understood would reshape both of their futures far more than either of them could have imagined. 3 days after Wren arrived at the Blackthorn compound, a jar of healing salve shattered on the stone floor, and every eye in the kitchen turned toward her as though she had broken something far more important than glass. "Careful," snapped a sharp voice belonging to a kitchen worker named Delia, who had made her dislike of Wren clear from the very first morning. "We do not have salve to waste on clumsy strays." Wren knelt quickly, gathering the broken shards before the sticky liquid could spread further across the floor. Her hands moved fast, though her cheeks burned with embarrassment. She had been carrying too many jars at once, trying to prove she could handle more responsibility than the others expected of her. "It was an accident," said Ivy, a younger kitchen worker who had been kind to Ren since her first day. She knelt beside Ren, helping gather the mess without hesitation. It could have happened to anyone. Delia rolled her eyes and walked away, muttering something about strays who did not belong anywhere near a pack's supplies. Ren said nothing, focusing on cleaning the floor until it looked as though nothing had happened at all. "Do not listen to her," Ivy whispered once Delia was out of earshot. "She does not trust anyone new. It has nothing to do with you specifically." Ren appreciated the reassurance, though weeks of suspicion from most of the pack had already worn a groove of doubt into her mind. She had been given food, shelter, and a chance to repay her debt honestly, but acceptance from the pack itself remained just out of reach, hovering somewhere between curiosity and distrust. She finished her kitchen duties for the morning and moved on to her afternoon task, assisting Beatrice in the healing quarters. It was work Ren had come to enjoy far more than she expected, learning how to identify herbs, how to clean wounds properly, and how to comfort frightened pack members who came in pain. "You have a steady hand," Beatrice commented one afternoon, watching Ren wrap a bandage around a young guard's arm with careful precision. "Where did you learn this?" "My mother," Ren said quietly. It was one of the few memories she allowed herself to think about without flinching. She used to help our old pack's healer before. She stopped herself before finishing the sentence, unwilling to explain the details of everything that had happened before she ended up alone. Beatrice did not push for more information, something Ren silently appreciated. Most people who asked about her past expected an explanation, expected details about exactly how she ended up abandoned and packless. Beatrice simply nodded and let the moment pass without demanding anything further. That evening, as Ren carried a tray of supplies back toward the healing quarters, she nearly collided with someone rounding the corner of the hallway too quickly. Strong hands caught her shoulders before she could stumble, steadying her before the tray could crash to the ground. She looked up and found herself staring directly into golden eyes. "Careful," Ronan said, his voice quieter than she remembered from the hall, though no less commanding. "My apologies, Alpha," Ren said quickly, stepping back the moment she regained her balance. She had barely seen him since the day of her judgment. He rarely came near the kitchens or healing quarters, and she had assumed he had already forgotten about the stray Omega he had shown mercy toward. "You are settling in?" he asked, an odd note of genuine curiosity in his tone. "Yes, Alpha," she answered carefully, unsure how much honesty was appropriate. "That is not an answer," he said, studying her expression the way he had that first morning near the storehouse. "You are settling in, or you are surviving another new place the way you have survived every place before this one." The question caught her off guard, cutting closer to the truth than she expected. She hesitated, unsure how to respond to a king who seemed genuinely interested in an answer beyond simple politeness. "Both, perhaps," she admitted finally. Something flickered across Ronan's face, an expression she could not quite place. Understanding, maybe, or something closer to respect for her honesty. "Beatrice tells me you have a talent for healing work," he said. "She is a patient teacher," Ren replied, unsure why the Alpha King was taking time out of his day to discuss her progress in the healing quarters. "I am glad you have found something here that suits you," Ronan said, and then, almost as an afterthought, added, "The pack can be slow to trust outsiders. It does not mean you are unwelcome. It only means trust here is earned carefully, the same as anywhere else." Ren studied him for a moment, trying to determine whether his words carried any hidden meaning beyond simple encouragement. She found none, only the same steady honesty she had noticed the first time he spoke to her in the hall. "Thank you, Alpha," she said finally. He gave a small nod and continued down the hallway, leaving Ren standing alone with her tray of supplies and a strange warmth spreading through her chest that had nothing to do with the kitchen fires she had left behind. Word of the brief encounter spread through the pack faster than Ren expected. By the following morning, whispers followed her through the halls, speculation about why the Alpha King had personally checked on a stray's progress within his household. "He has never done that for any other servant," Delia muttered to another kitchen worker, loud enough for Ren to hear clearly. "Strange, is it not, an Alpha King concerning himself with an unclaimed Omega who stole from his own storehouse?" Ren ignored the comment, focusing on her work, though the words lingered in her mind longer than she wanted to admit. She told herself it meant nothing, that Ronan was simply checking on the progress of someone under his protection, the same as any responsible leader might do. But a small, cautious part of her wondered if there was more to it than duty alone. Days passed, and Ren settled into a rhythm within the pack. splitting her time between kitchen duties and healing work under Beatrice's guidance. Slowly, the whispers around her began to quiet, replaced by cautious acceptance from at least a handful of pack members who saw her genuine effort, rather than simply her status as an outsider. Ivy became something close to a friend, sharing quiet meals with Ren during breaks and asking careful questions about her past, without ever pushing too hard for answers Ren was not ready to give. Beatrice treated her with steady respect, praising her progress without ever making her feel like a burden. Even Halden, who had dragged her before the Alpha with obvious suspicion that first morning, softened slightly in his interactions with her, nodding a brief greeting whenever their paths crossed during his patrols. Only Garrick remained openly wary, watching Ren whenever their paths crossed with the careful scrutiny of someone waiting for her to prove all his warnings correct. Ren did her best to avoid his attention entirely, uninterested in giving him any reason to push harder for her exile. One afternoon, nearly 3 weeks after her arrival, Ren found herself alone in the healing quarters, organizing herbs into careful rows while Beatrice attended to matters elsewhere in the compound. The door opened quietly, and she turned to find Ronan standing in the doorway, an unreadable expression on his face. "Alpha," she said, straightening immediately. "Beatrice is not here at the moment, but I can send for her." "I did not come to see Beatrice," Ronan said, stepping fully into the room. His eyes moved over the neatly organized shelves, the careful labels Ren had written for each herb, the evidence of weeks of steady, quiet effort. "I came to see how her apprentice was managing." Ren's cheeks warmed slightly under his attention. "I am managing well, Alpha. Beatrice has taught me a great deal." "So I have heard," he said. "The guard you treated last week for the training injury has spoken highly of your care." "It was a simple wound," Ren said, uncomfortable with praise she was not used to receiving. "Nothing more than careful bandaging." "Careful bandaging that stopped an infection before it could spread," Ronan corrected gently. "Do not diminish your own skill, Ren. Few people manage kindness as naturally as you seem to." The use of her name, spoken so simply and directly, sent an unexpected warmth through her chest. She was not used to being addressed with such quiet familiarity, especially not by someone as powerful as the Alpha King of an entire territory. "Thank you, Alpha," she said again, unsure how else to respond. "Ronan," he corrected. "When we are not standing in front of the full pack, you may call me Ronan." Ren blinked, surprised by the offer. It felt like far more than simple politeness, a small crack in the careful formality that had defined every interaction between them since her arrival. "That does not seem appropriate," she said carefully. "You are the Alpha King. I am an apprentice healer with steady hands and careful judgment," Ronan interrupted, his tone firm but not unkind. "Titles do not have to define every interaction between two people, Ren." She studied him for a long moment, trying to understand the strange shift happening between them. A shift she did not fully trust but could not deny either. Weeks ago, she had expected punishment for stealing 2 strips of dried meat. Now the same Alpha King who had spared her stood in front of her, offering something that felt dangerously close to genuine friendship. "Ronan," she said finally, testing the name carefully. Something in his expression softened at the sound of his own name from her lips, though he quickly masked it with his usual composed demeanor. "I should return to my duties," he said, though he made no immediate move to leave. "The Pack Council meets soon, and Garrick grows impatient when I am late." "Of course," Ren said, though a small part of her wished he would stay longer. Ronan lingered a moment more, his golden eyes studying her face as though searching for something he had not yet found. Then, with a small nod, he turned and left the healing quarters, his footsteps echoing down the hallway until they faded into silence. Ren stood alone amid the neatly organized herbs, her heart beating faster than the moment warranted. She told herself it was simple gratitude, simple relief that the Alpha who had spared her life continued to check on her well-being. But as she returned to her work, sorting herbs with hands that trembled slightly more than they had before his visit, she knew the truth was becoming harder to deny with each passing day. Something was shifting between them, slow and quiet, but undeniable all the same. And Ren, who had spent months teaching herself never to trust kindness without suspicion, found herself unsure whether to run from that shift or lean carefully into it. Outside the healing quarters, Ronan walked toward the council chamber with his mind far from the political matters waiting for him there. He told himself his visits to check on Ren's progress were simple duty, the responsibility of an Alpha ensuring every member of his territory thrived under his protection. But even as he told himself that familiar explanation, he knew it was becoming harder to believe. Something about Ren's quiet resilience, her careful honesty, and the steady strength beneath her exhaustion had settled into his mind in a way he had not experienced with anyone else in his long years of leadership. He did not yet understand what that meant. But as the days passed and his visits to check on her continued more often than duty alone required, Ronan Blackthorne began to suspect that the starving Omega who had stolen from his storehouse was slowly stealing something far more valuable than dried meat. The council chamber fell silent the moment Garrick raised a folded letter bearing an unfamiliar seal, the wax pressed with the mark of a pack Wren had never expected to hear mentioned inside these walls again. "A proposal has arrived from the Silver Pine Pack," Garrick announced, his eyes briefly flicking toward Ronan before addressing the gathered council. "Their Alpha wishes to discuss a union between his daughter, Lady Freya, and our Alpha King." Wren was not present in the council chamber, but Ivy delivered the news to her later that afternoon while they folded fresh linens together in the servant quarters, her voice hushed with the kind of excitement reserved for pack gossip. "A union," Ivy repeated, clearly fascinated by the prospect. "It would strengthen ties between two of the strongest territories in the north. Garrick has wanted an alliance like this for years." Wren kept her hands steady as she folded the linen in front of her, though something uncomfortable twisted in her chest at the news. She told herself it made sense. Ronan was an Alpha King, expected to secure alliances and strengthen his territory through strategic decisions. A political mating with the daughter of a powerful neighboring pack was exactly the kind of decision expected of someone in his position. It had nothing to do with her. "Do you think he will agree?" Ivy asked, apparently unaware of the sudden tension in Wren's shoulders. "That is not something I would know," Wren said carefully, focusing intently on the linen in front of her, rather than the strange ache settling in her chest. Ivy studied her for a moment, something knowing flickering behind her eyes. "You have grown close to him," she said quietly. "Everyone in the kitchens has noticed his visits." "He checks on my progress," Wren said quickly. "Nothing more." Ivy did not push further, though her expression suggested she was not entirely convinced. Wren finished folding the linens in silence, her mind circling around the news of Lady Freya far more than she wanted to admit. That evening, Wren found herself in the healing quarters longer than necessary, organizing supplies that did not truly need organizing, avoiding the quiet solitude of her small room, where her thoughts would have nowhere else to go except toward the strange, unwelcome jealousy twisting inside her. She was still there when the door opened and Ronan stepped inside, looking more tired than she had seen him since her arrival. "You are working late," he observed, closing the door behind him. "So are you, it seems," Wren replied, though her tone carried more edge than she intended. Ronan raised an eyebrow slightly at her sharpness but did not comment on it directly. Instead, he moved further into the room, settling onto a wooden stool near the herb shelves, rubbing his temples with visible exhaustion. "The council meeting ran long," he said. "I heard," Wren said before she could stop herself. Ronan's eyes lifted to meet hers, something curious flickering behind his exhaustion. "Word travels fast within these walls." "Faster than most things," Wren agreed, focusing her attention back on the herbs in front of her rather than the way his gaze lingered on her face. A long silence stretched between them, filled with words neither seemed willing to speak aloud. Finally, Ronan broke it. "You have heard about the proposal, then?" "I have," Wren confirmed, her voice carefully neutral. "It is simply a proposal," Ronan said. "Nothing has been decided." "It is not my place to have an opinion on your alliances, Alpha," Wren said, though the formal title felt strange after weeks of him insisting she use his name instead. Ronan's jaw tightened slightly at her deliberate distance. "Ronan," he corrected quietly. "Ronan," she repeated, though the correction did little to soften the tension between them. "You have an opinion," he said, studying her carefully. "I can see it in your expression, even if you refuse to voice it." Wren hesitated, unsure whether honesty would help or harm whatever fragile connection had formed between them over the past weeks. Finally, she set down the herbs in her hands and turned to face him directly. "I have no right to an opinion about who you choose to align yourself with," she said carefully. "You are an Alpha King. Your decisions affect an entire territory, not just yourself. Whatever alliance benefits your pack the most is the correct choice, regardless of what I think about it." "That is a very diplomatic answer," Ronan observed. "It is also not actually an answer to what I asked." Wren's cheeks flushed slightly under the weight of his attention. "What do you want me to say, Ronan?" "The truth," he said simply. "You have been honest with me since the moment I found you at the storehouse. Do not stop now." She studied him for a long moment, weighing the risk of honesty against the safety of careful distance. Finally she spoke, her voice quieter than before. "I do not like the idea of it," she admitted. I know it is not my place to feel that way. I know you have obligations to your pack that matter far more than my feelings. But the idea of Lady Freya standing beside you, becoming your Luna, makes something in my chest ache in a way I do not fully understand. The confession hung heavy in the air between them, more vulnerable than anything Ren had allowed herself to voice since arriving at the Blackthorn compound. She half expected Ronan to remind her gently of her place, to explain patiently that whatever she felt could not matter against the weight of political necessity. Instead, something shifted in his expression, a warmth breaking through the exhaustion that had lined his face moments before. "I have not accepted the proposal," he said quietly. "I have delayed my answer to the Silverpine Alpha for longer than Garrick believes is wise." "Why?" Ren asked, though part of her already suspected the answer. "Because every time I consider agreeing to it, I think of someone else standing beside me instead," Ronan admitted, his voice low and careful, as though testing how much honesty the moment could hold. Ren's breath caught. She stared at him, searching his expression for any sign that his words carried a meaning different from what her heart desperately wanted them to mean. "Ronan," she started, though she did not know what she intended to say next. "I know what tradition expects of me," he continued before she could finish. "I know Garrick believes an alliance with Silverpine would strengthen our territory against threats from the Eastern Pacts. I know every reasonable argument in favor of accepting Lady Freya's hand. But," Ren prompted quietly, "but none of those arguments account for what I feel when I am near you," he said, his golden eyes steady on her face despite the vulnerability of the admission. "None of them explain why a stolen strip of dried meat led to the most important decision I have made as Alpha King in years." Ren's heart pounded so loudly she was certain he could hear it. She had spent weeks convincing herself that whatever warmth existed between them was simple gratitude, simple curiosity from a king checking on the well-being of someone under his protection. Hearing him speak so plainly shattered that careful explanation entirely. "I am an unclaimed Omega with no pack, no title, and no political value to offer your territory," she said, though the words felt hollow even as she spoke them. "Whatever this is between us, it does not change the reality of what an alliance with Silverpine could offer your people." "You are underestimating your worth," Ronan said firmly, standing from the stool and closing the distance between them. "Value is not only measured in political alliances and territorial strength. Sometimes it is measured in resilience, honesty, and the kind of quiet strength that holds an entire pack together without anyone fully recognizing it." Ren's throat tightened with emotion she had not allowed herself to feel in longer than she could remember. She had spent so long believing herself worthless in the eyes of anyone with power, and standing here, hearing an Alpha King describe her worth in such simple, genuine terms, felt like something breaking open inside her chest. "I do not know what to do with what you are telling me," she admitted honestly. "You do not have to know yet," Ronan said gently. "I am not asking you to make any decisions tonight. I am simply telling you the truth. Because you deserve honesty far more than careful diplomacy." They stood close together in the quiet healing quarters, the weight of unspoken possibility settling between them like something fragile and new. Ren did not know what would happen next, whether Ronan would eventually be forced by tradition and duty to accept the Silverpine proposal despite his words tonight, or whether something else entirely was beginning to take shape between them. But for the first time since arriving at the Blackthorn compound, she allowed herself to hope that maybe, despite everything she had lost and everything she had survived, she had found something worth staying for. "I should return to my quarters," she said finally, though she made no immediate move to leave. "Ren," Ronan said softly, and she paused, turning back to face him. "Thank you for your honesty tonight." "Thank you for yours," she replied, before finally stepping past him and out into the quiet corridor beyond, her mind spinning with everything that had just passed between them. Behind her, Ronan remained standing in the healing quarters for a long while, staring at the door she had walked through, his thoughts far from the political alliance Garrick expected him to consider carefully. He knew the decision ahead of him would not be simple, that tradition and duty would push hard against whatever was growing quietly between himself and the Omega who had stolen from his storehouse weeks ago. But standing there in the quiet aftermath of her honesty, Ronan Blackthorn understood with sudden clarity that he was no longer willing to let duty alone decide his future, not when something far more important had already begun stealing pieces of his heart, one honest conversation at a time. A messenger arrived at the Blackthorn compound just after sunrise, his horse lathered with sweat from hard travel, his face pale with the kind of urgency that immediately drew attention from every guard along the outer gate. Ren was crossing the training yard with a basket of clean bandages when she noticed the commotion, guards gathering quickly around the exhausted rider as he dismounted. Something about the pack crest stitched into his travel cloak made her stomach drop before she even understood why. Ashgrove. The mark of her former pack. She froze in place, the basket nearly slipping from her fingers, as old fear flooded back into her chest with brutal force. She had not seen that crest in months, had spent every day since her exile trying to convince herself she would never have to see it again. "State your business," Halden demanded, stepping forward to intercept the messenger before he could move further into the compound. "I carry a message for Alpha Ronan Blackthorn," the messenger said, breathless from his journey. "From Alpha Dorian Ashgrove. It concerns a matter of pack property." Wren's blood ran cold. Pack property. She knew immediately, with sickening certainty, exactly what matter the messenger intended to discuss. She did not wait to hear more. She turned and hurried toward the healing quarters, her hands trembling so badly she nearly dropped the basket twice before reaching the door. Beatrice looked up from her work, immediately noticing the pale terror written across Wren's face. "What has happened?" Beatrice asked, setting down the herbs in her hands. "A messenger," Wren managed, her voice barely steady. "From Ashgrove." Beatrice's expression shifted immediately to concern. She had heard enough fragments of Wren's past over the weeks to understand the weight behind that single word. "Sit down before you fall down," Beatrice instructed firmly, guiding Wren toward a chair near the herb shelves. "Breathe. Whatever this messenger wants, Ronan will not simply hand you over without understanding the full truth first." Wren wanted desperately to believe that, but months of learned fear made trust difficult even now. She had spent so long convincing herself that her former pack had forgotten about her entirely, that whatever cruelty had driven her out was buried in the past along with the rest of her old life. Word spread through the compound quickly that Ronan had called the messenger into the Great Hall for a private audience. Wren sat in the healing quarters, unable to focus on any task, her mind spinning through every possible outcome of whatever conversation was happening behind those closed doors. An hour passed before Halden appeared in the healing quarters doorway, his expression carefully neutral in a way that told Wren immediately something significant had occurred. "The Alpha wishes to see you," Halden said. "Now." Wren's legs felt unsteady as she rose from the chair, following Halden through the compound toward the Great Hall. Every step felt heavier than the last, old fears resurfacing with a force she had not expected to feel again after weeks of relative safety. The Great Hall was empty except for Ronan, who stood near the throne with a folded letter clutched tightly in one hand, his expression darker than Wren had ever seen it. The messenger had already been dismissed, sent to wait in the guest quarters while Ronan considered his response. "Alpha," Wren said carefully, unsure what to expect from his grim expression. "Sit," Ronan said, his voice gentler than his face suggested, gesturing toward a bench near the hall's long table. "Please." Wren sat, her hands folded tightly in her lap to hide their trembling. Ronan remained standing for a long moment, staring at the letter in his hands before finally speaking. "Alpha Dorian Ashgrove claims you belong to his pack," Ronan said carefully. "He states you left without proper release from your obligations and demands your immediate return." Wren's stomach twisted violently. "I did not leave without release," she said, her voice shaking despite her effort to control it. "I was cast out." "That is not what this letter states," Ronan said, holding up the parchment briefly before setting it down on the table. "But I did not summon you here to recite his claims. I summoned you here because I want to hear the truth from you directly, whatever that truth may be." Wren hesitated, old wounds threatening to surface after months of carefully burying them beneath survival and distraction. She had never told anyone the full story of why she had been forced from her pack, not even Beatrice or Ivy, who had become closer to her than anyone since her exile began. "It is not a simple story," she said quietly. "I have time," Ronan said, sitting across from her, his golden eyes steady and patient, despite the tension still lining his shoulders. Wren took a deep breath, forcing herself past the fear that had kept this story locked inside her for so long. "My parents were respected members of the Ashgrove pack," she began. "My father served as a senior guard, and my mother assisted the pack healer. We were not wealthy, but we were valued, protected." "What changed?" Ronan asked gently. "Alpha Dorian's son," Wren said, her voice tightening with old pain. "He took an interest in me when I was younger than I should have been for such attention. My father refused to allow it, refused to let his son treat me as though I belonged to him, simply because of his position within the pack." Ronan's expression darkened further, his jaw tightening at the implication behind her words. "My father's refusal angered Alpha Dorian," Wren continued, forcing herself through the difficult memory. "He accused my father of disrespecting pack leadership, of undermining his son's authority. Within weeks, my parents were dead, killed during what the pack called a border skirmish, though I never fully believed that explanation. You believe Dorian was responsible, Ronan said quietly, understanding settling into his expression. I do not have proof, Ren admitted, but I know what I saw in the days before their deaths. I know how quickly Alpha Dorian's anger cooled once they were gone, and his son's interest in me became something no one dared to question anymore. And after their deaths, Ronan pressed gently. I ran, Ren said simply. Before his son could act on whatever plans Alpha Dorian intended for me, I had nothing. No protection, no pack willing to intervene on behalf of a grieving orphan against their Alpha's son. Running felt like the only choice that might keep me alive. Silence settled between them, heavy with the weight of Ren's confession. Ronan's hands had curled into fists at some point during her story, his knuckles white with barely contained anger. He is claiming you as pack property, Ronan said finally, his voice low and controlled despite the fury simmering beneath it. After what he allowed to happen to your parents, after driving you into exile with nothing, he now demands your return, as though you belong to him. I do not want to go back, Ren said, her voice breaking slightly, despite her effort to remain composed. I would rather face exile again, rather face the wilderness alone, than return to a pack that let my parents die, and would have handed me over to a man who terrified me since I was barely more than a child. Ronan rose from his seat, moving around the table until he stood directly in front of her, his expression fierce with a protectiveness that startled Ren with its intensity. You will not return to Ashgrove, Ronan said firmly. Not now, not ever, regardless of whatever claims Alpha Dorian believes he holds over you. He is a powerful Alpha, Ren said carefully. Refusing his demand could create conflict between your territories. Let it, Ronan said, his voice sharp with conviction. I will not hand over a woman fleeing genuine danger simply to avoid inconvenient political tension with a man who allowed her parents to be murdered and intended worse for her afterward. Ren stared at him, overwhelmed by the fierce protectiveness in his expression, so different from the careful, calculated leadership she had witnessed from him in the council chamber weeks earlier. This was not simply an Alpha King protecting property within his territory. This was something far more personal, far more fierce. Thank you, she whispered, though the words felt inadequate against the depth of what he was offering her. You do not need to thank me for refusing to allow cruelty, Ronan said, his tone softening slightly as he knelt in front of her chair, bringing his eyes level with hers. You survived something no one should have had to survive alone. You do not owe gratitude for basic decency. Ren felt tears building behind her eyes, emotions she had carefully controlled for months, finally threatening to break free under the weight of his fierce, unwavering support. What will you tell the messenger? She asked, forcing herself to focus on practical matters rather than the overwhelming emotion building in her chest. The truth, Ronan said simply, that Ren is under my protection, that her presence within my territory was earned through honest labor and genuine need, and that Alpha Dorian's claim holds no legitimacy given the circumstances of her exile. He will not accept that easily, Ren warned. Then he will learn exactly how far I am willing to go to protect what matters to me, Ronan said, his voice carrying a quiet, dangerous edge that left no doubt about the sincerity behind his words. Ren studied him carefully, searching for any sign of hesitation or doubt behind his fierce declaration. She found none, only steady, unwavering resolve, the same resolve that had spared her from punishment weeks ago when every expectation demanded otherwise. I am not ready to face him, she admitted quietly. Even with your protection, the thought of confronting Alpha Dorian again terrifies me. You will not have to face him alone, Ronan promised. Whatever comes from this, I will stand beside you through all of it. The sincerity in his words settled something deep within Ren's chest, a fragile hope she had not allowed herself to feel in longer than she could remember. She did not know what challenges lay ahead, whether Alpha Dorian would accept Ronan's refusal quietly, or escalate the conflict into something far more dangerous. But for the first time since fleeing her old pack, she did not feel entirely alone in facing whatever storm was building on the horizon, and that alone felt like more protection than she had known in longer than she cared to remember. Outside the Great Hall, storm clouds gathered slowly over the Blackthorn territory, a fitting reflection of the conflict now brewing between two powerful packs, both bound together by the fate of a woman who had once believed herself worth nothing more than a stray thief scavenging for scraps to survive. The messenger left the Blackthorn compound the following morning carrying Ronan's refusal sealed with the mark of his territory, and within the pack, tension settled like a heavy fog that refused to lift. Ren felt it everywhere she went, in the careful glances of guards along the outer wall, in the hushed conversations that stopped abruptly whenever she entered a room. They are saying war may come from this, Ivy admitted one afternoon as they worked together folding fresh linens, her voice quieter than usual. Ashgrove is not a small pack. If Alpha Dorian decides to push the matter further, it could mean real conflict. Wren's hands stilled over the linen in front of her, guilt twisting sharp and sudden in her chest. This is because of me, she said quietly. Because Ronan refused to hand me over. This is because Alpha Dorian is a cruel man, who allowed innocent people to suffer, and now wants to reclaim what he believes belongs to him, Ivy corrected firmly. None of this is your fault, Wren. Do not carry guilt that belongs entirely to him. Wren appreciated Ivy's reassurance, though the weight of potential conflict did not lift easily from her shoulders. She had spent months believing herself insignificant, astray with no value beyond simple survival. The idea that her presence within the Blackthorn territory could now spark tension between two powerful packs felt almost impossible to reconcile with everything she had believed about herself for so long. Despite the growing tension, life within the compound continued its careful rhythm. Wren continued her work in the healing quarters, her bond with Beatrice deepening with each passing day, as she learned more about herbal remedies and proper wound care. Her friendship with Ivy remained a steady source of comfort, one of the few relationships within the pack that felt entirely uncomplicated by politics or fear. And her relationship with Ronan continued shifting into something neither of them had fully defined, though both understood clearly that whatever existed between them had moved far beyond simple duty or gratitude. He found reasons to visit the healing quarters more often now, sometimes staying only long enough to check on her well-being, other times lingering for hours discussing matters far beyond pack business. Wren found herself looking forward to these visits more than she wanted to admit, the quiet warmth of his presence becoming something she relied on more than she had relied on anything in longer than she could remember. One evening, nearly a week after the messenger's departure, Ronan found her sitting alone near the edge of the training yard, watching the sunset paint the sky in soft shades of orange and purple. He settled beside her without asking permission, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. You seem troubled, he observed. I keep thinking about what might happen if Alpha Dorian does not accept your refusal quietly, Wren admitted, her eyes fixed on the horizon rather than his face. I do not want to be the reason your pack faces conflict. You are not the reason, Ronan said firmly. Dorian's cruelty is the reason, his willingness to sacrifice innocent people to protect his own reputation, and his son's desires is the reason. You are simply someone who survived circumstances that should never have happened in the first place. That is a generous way to view it, Wren said quietly. It is the truthful way to view it, Ronan corrected. He turned slightly to face her, his expression softening from its usual composed leadership into something far more personal. Wren, I need you to understand something clearly. Whatever conflict arises from my refusal to hand you over, I would make the same decision again without hesitation. You are not a burden I am reluctantly protecting. You are someone I have chosen to protect, fully and completely. Wren's breath caught at the sincerity in his voice, the fierce conviction behind his words settling deep into her chest. She turned to face him fully, searching his golden eyes for any hint of doubt behind his declaration. She found none. I do not know how to accept kindness like this, she admitted honestly. I spent so long believing I deserved nothing beyond simple survival that this, whatever this is between us, feels almost impossible to trust fully. You do not have to trust it all at once, Ronan said gently. Trust can be built slowly, the same way you have built trust with Beatrice, with Ivy, with this entire pack over the past weeks. I am simply asking you not to close yourself off entirely from the possibility that this could be real. Wren studied his face carefully, the honest vulnerability in his expression so different from the composed Alpha King she had first encountered near the storehouse weeks ago. Something in his openness gave her the courage to voice a question she had been carrying silently for days. What is happening between us, Ronan? She asked quietly. I do not have the experience to understand what this feeling is, this pull I feel whenever you are near. Ronan's expression shifted, something serious and slightly nervous crossing his features, an emotion Wren had never witnessed from him before. Wolves sometimes experience something called a fated bond, he said carefully, a connection between two individuals that forms naturally, without either person choosing it deliberately. It is rare, and not every wolf experiences it during their lifetime. You believe this is what is happening between us? Wren asked, her heart pounding rapidly at the implication behind his words. I believe it is possible, Ronan admitted. I have felt something toward you since the very first morning near the storehouse, something I could not fully explain through simple duty or curiosity alone. It has only grown stronger with each conversation, each moment spent in your presence. Ren's mind raced, trying to process the weight of what he was describing. A fated bond was not something she had ever expected to experience, especially not with someone as powerful and significant as an Alpha King. "What does a bond like this mean?" she asked carefully. "It means our connection runs deeper than simple attraction or affection," Ronan explained. "If we choose to accept it fully, it would create a permanent connection between us, tying our lives together in a way that cannot easily be undone." "And if we do not choose to accept it?" Ren asked. "Then it remains simply a pull, an awareness between us that never fully develops into something permanent," Ronan said. "The choice belongs entirely to both of us. No bond forms without mutual acceptance." Ren fell silent, absorbing the weight of everything he had just shared. Part of her wanted desperately to accept whatever connection was forming between them, to allow herself the comfort and safety his protection had already provided her. But another part of her, shaped by months of fear and betrayal, hesitated at the idea of tying her fate so permanently to anyone, regardless of how genuine his care seemed. "I am afraid," she admitted honestly, "not of you, but of what happens if I allow myself to trust this fully, and it eventually breaks apart the way everything else in my life has broken apart." "I cannot promise you certainty," Ronan said gently. "No one can promise that fully in any relationship, bonded or otherwise. But I can promise you that I have never felt toward anyone what I feel toward you, and I have no intention of allowing that feeling to fade or falter." Ren studied him carefully, searching for any hint of doubt or hesitation behind his steady declaration. She found only quiet, unwavering sincerity, the same sincerity that had convinced her weeks ago that his mercy at the storehouse had been genuine, rather than some elaborate cruelty in disguise. "I need time," she said finally. "Not because I doubt your sincerity, but because I need to be certain I am choosing this for myself, rather than simply accepting it out of gratitude for everything you have already done for me." "Take whatever time you need," Ronan said without hesitation. "I am not asking you to decide tonight, or tomorrow, or even within the coming weeks. I am simply asking you to remain open to the possibility, rather than closing yourself off entirely out of fear." Ren nodded slowly, grateful for his patience despite the uncertainty still swirling within her chest. They sat together in comfortable silence as the last remnants of sunset faded into evening, the weight of unspoken possibility settling gently between them rather than pressing urgently for immediate resolution. Days passed, and the careful rhythm of pack life continued alongside the quiet development of whatever connection existed between Ren and Ronan. She continued her work with Beatrice, her friendship with Ivy, and her cautious steps toward genuine belonging within the Blackthorn territory. And slowly, carefully, she allowed herself to consider a future she had never dared imagine possible during the desperate months of her exile. But even as hope began building steadily within her chest, the shadow of Alpha Dorian's rejected demand lingered over the compound, a threat neither Ren nor Ronan could ignore for long. Whatever peace they were building together, both understood clearly that a reckoning with her former pack remained inevitable, waiting somewhere on the horizon like storm clouds gathering slowly before finally breaking loose. The horns sounded from the outer wall just after midday. 3 sharp blasts that Ren had learned during her weeks at the compound meant visitors approaching who were not simply traders or wandering messengers. She set down the bandages she had been folding and hurried toward the window, her heart already pounding with dread before she even saw the approaching group. A formation of wolves moved steadily up the main road toward the Blackthorn gates, their formal cloaks marked unmistakably with the Ashgrove crest. At the front of the group rode a broad-shouldered man with graying hair and a cold, calculating expression that Ren recognized instantly despite the months since she had last seen his face. Alpha Dorian Ashgrove had come himself. He would not travel this far simply to repeat a rejected demand through another messenger, Beatrice said grimly, appearing beside Ren at the window. "This means he intends to press the matter directly." Ren's hands trembled as she watched the formation approach the gates. Guards along the wall straightened immediately, word already spreading through the compound about the arrival of a rival Alpha with an unresolved claim against one of their own. "I need to warn Ronan," Ren said, though she suspected the entire compound already knew of the approaching threat. "He already knows," Beatrice said gently. "Halden sent word the moment the formation was spotted on the horizon. Ronan is likely already preparing to meet them." Ren's stomach twisted with anxiety. She had hoped, perhaps foolishly, that Alpha Dorian would accept Ronan's refusal and abandon his claim, rather than risk direct confrontation between 2 powerful territories. Watching him ride toward the gates himself shattered that hope entirely. She hurried from the healing quarters toward the Great Hall, weaving through gathering crowds of pack members who had noticed the commotion and gathered to witness whatever confrontation was about to unfold. She found Ronan near the entrance, dressed formally, his expression composed but hard as stone. "You should remain inside," he said the moment he noticed her approaching. "This conversation may become difficult, and I do not want you exposed to whatever Dorian intends to say." "I cannot hide while my fate is decided by others," Ren said firmly, surprising herself with the steadiness in her voice. "If Alpha Dorian has come to claim me, I deserve to stand here and speak for myself rather than remain hidden away like something without a voice." Ronan studied her for a long moment, respect flickering behind his composed expression despite the tension of the moment. "Stay close to me then," he said finally. "Whatever happens, do not approach him directly without my protection beside you." Ren nodded, grateful for his willingness to allow her presence despite obvious concern for her safety. Together, they walked toward the main gates where Alpha Dorian and his formation had already dismounted, waiting with cold patience for their formal reception. The moment Alpha Dorian's eyes landed on Ren, something ugly flickered behind his expression, quickly masked by practiced composure. "Alpha Blackthorn," Dorian said, offering a shallow bow that carried more mockery than respect. "I appreciate you finally granting me an audience regarding this matter. You are here regarding a claim I have already rejected through proper channels," Ronan said, his voice cold and controlled. "I fail to see what additional discussion is necessary." "Perhaps my written explanation lacked sufficient detail," Dorian said smoothly. "The Omega standing beside you departed my territory without proper release from her obligations. Regardless of the circumstances surrounding her departure, she remains bound to my pack until such release is formally granted. The circumstances surrounding her departure involved the deaths of her parents under suspicious conditions, followed by clear intent from your son to claim her against her wishes," Ronan said, his voice sharpening with barely contained anger. "I fail to see how any binding obligation survives circumstances that grave." Dorian's composed expression flickered slightly, irritation breaking through his careful mask. "Accusations without proof mean little, Alpha Blackthorn. I would advise caution before repeating such claims publicly." "I have heard her account directly," Ronan said firmly. "I find it entirely credible, particularly given your evident determination to reclaim her despite months of apparent indifference to her well-being until now." Murmurs rippled through the gathered crowd of Blackthorn pack members, many of whom had already heard fragments of Ren's story through weeks of quiet gossip. Dorian's eyes narrowed slightly at the visible support gathering around his rejected claim. "This is not simply a matter of personal opinion, Alpha Blackthorn," Dorian said, his tone hardening. "Pack law recognizes clear obligations regarding departed members. If you continue harboring her against my formal claim, you risk violating treaties that have governed relations between our territories for generations." "I risk nothing by protecting someone fleeing genuine danger," Ronan said firmly. "If those treaties require me to hand over an innocent woman to a pack that failed to protect her family and intended to force her into an unwanted arrangement with your son, then those treaties deserve to be reconsidered entirely." Dorian's face flushed with barely contained fury at Ronan's open defiance. He glanced briefly at Ren, his expression carrying something cold and calculating that made her skin crawl despite the protection of Ronan's presence beside her. "You believe hiding behind an Alpha King's protection changes anything, girl?" Dorian said directly to Ren, his voice carrying enough volume to ensure the surrounding crowd heard clearly. "You remain pack property regardless of whose territory you currently occupy." Ren's chest tightened with old fear, but she forced herself to meet his gaze directly, refusing to shrink beneath his cold stare the way she once might have. "I am not property," she said, her voice steadier than she expected. "I never was, regardless of how your pack chose to treat me. My parents served your territory faithfully, and in return, you allowed their deaths and intended to force me into circumstances I never consented to. Whatever obligation you believe exists between us ended the moment you failed to protect the people who trusted your leadership." The crowd fell silent at her bold declaration, several pack members exchanging surprised glances at the Omega's willingness to speak so directly against a rival Alpha. Dorian's expression darkened further, clearly unused to such direct challenge from someone he considered beneath him. "Careful, girl," Dorian warned coldly. "Boldness does not suit someone in your position." "She is not addressing you from a position of weakness," Ronan interjected sharply, stepping slightly forward to place himself firmly between Ren and Dorian's cold gaze. "She stands here under my protection, within my territory, speaking truths that your own pack should have addressed months ago rather than ignoring until convenient political leverage arose." Dorian's jaw tightened, fury visibly simmering beneath his controlled exterior. He studied Ronan for a long moment, clearly recalculating whatever strategy he had planned for this confrontation now that both Ronan and Ren had refused to yield beneath his intimidation. "This matter is far from settled, Alpha Blackthorn," Dorian said finally, his voice cold with barely restrained anger. "I will return to my territory and consult with my council regarding appropriate next steps. But do not mistake my departure today for surrender. I do not abandon claims easily, particularly ones involving matters of pack honor." "Consult with whoever you wish," Ronan replied evenly. "My answer will remain unchanged regardless of whatever additional pressure you attempt to apply. Ren remains under my protection, and I will defend that protection through whatever means necessary." Dorian's cold eyes flicked once more toward Ren, something unsettling and possessive flickering behind his gaze before he finally turned and mounted his horse, his formation following closely behind as they departed the Blackthorn gates with visible tension still hanging heavy in the air. Ren remained frozen in place long after the formation disappeared down the main road, her body trembling with the aftermath of adrenaline and old fear finally released from tight control. Ronan turned to her immediately, concern replacing the fierce protectiveness that had defined his expression moments earlier. "You were incredibly brave," he said softly, reaching to steady her trembling hands with his own. "I do not feel brave," Ren admitted, her voice shaking slightly. "I feel terrified. He will not simply let this go, Ronan." I could see it in his expression. "I know," Ronan said grimly, "which means we must prepare carefully for whatever comes next, rather than assuming today's confrontation resolved anything permanently." Ren nodded, though anxiety still churned uncomfortably in her chest. She had spent months running from Alpha Dorian's shadow, and standing directly against him today, despite the fierce protection Ronan had provided, reminded her clearly that whatever peace she had found within the Blackthorn territory remained fragile against the looming threat of her former pack's determination. As the crowd slowly dispersed, murmuring amongst themselves about the tense confrontation they had just witnessed, Ronan guided Ren gently back toward the healing quarters, his hand remaining protectively at the small of her back the entire way. "Whatever comes next," he said quietly as they walked, "know that you will not face it alone. I meant every word I said to him today, Ren. You are under my protection, fully and completely, regardless of whatever additional pressure Dorian attempts to apply." Ren allowed herself a small measure of comfort in his steady reassurance, though the unsettling image of Alpha Dorian's cold, calculating expression lingered in her mind long after the confrontation had ended, a clear warning that the conflict between them remained far from resolved. Sleep did not come easily to Ren in the days following Alpha Dorian's visit. She lay awake each night, replaying his cold expression, his thinly veiled threats, and the unsettling certainty in his voice that the matter remained far from resolved. Even the comfort of her small, warm room within the Blackthorn compound could not fully quiet the anxiety coiling tight in her chest. "You have not been sleeping," Beatrice observed one morning, noting the shadows beneath Ren's eyes as she arrived for her healing duties. "I keep expecting him to return with an army instead of a formation of guards," Ren admitted honestly, arranging herbs with hands that felt heavier than usual from exhaustion. "Ronan has already increased patrols along our borders," Beatrice said gently. "Whatever Dorian attempts next, this pack will not be caught unprepared." Ren appreciated the reassurance, though the underlying tension remained difficult to shake entirely. She continued her duties throughout the day, grateful for the distraction of familiar tasks, though her mind kept drifting back to the cold calculation she had witnessed in Alpha Dorian's eyes. That evening, Ronan found her sitting alone near the healing quarters garden, staring at nothing in particular as the last light of day faded into deep blue dusk. "You seem far away," he observed, settling beside her on the stone bench. "I cannot stop thinking about what he might do next," Ren admitted. He did not seem like a man willing to simply accept defeat. "He is not," Ronan agreed grimly, "which is why I have spent the past several days strengthening our borders and gathering information about his movements through trusted allies in neighboring territories." Ren turned to study his profile in the fading light, appreciating the careful, methodical way he approached protecting his people, protecting her, despite the obvious toll the situation was taking on him as well. "I am grateful for everything you are doing," she said quietly, "but I worry about the cost this conflict might have on your pack. War with Ashgrove would affect far more people than simply myself. Any conflict Dorian chooses to start would be entirely his responsibility, not yours," Ronan said firmly. "I have made my position clear, and I do not intend to reconsider it regardless of whatever pressure he applies." Ren studied him carefully, noticing the slight tension around his eyes, the subtle exhaustion he was trying carefully to hide beneath his usual composed demeanor. "You are carrying a heavy burden," she said softly. "Leadership always carries weight. Ronan replied simply. But this particular burden feels different, because protecting you matters to me in a way that extends far beyond simple duty as an alpha. Ren's chest warmed at his words, the fierce sincerity behind them settling something anxious deep within her. Despite the looming threat from her former pack, moments like this, quiet and honest between herself and Ronan, continued reminding her that whatever happened next, she would not face it entirely alone. "I think I am ready," she said suddenly, surprising herself with the words before she had fully decided to speak them aloud. Ronan turned to face her fully, understanding immediately what she meant despite her vague phrasing. "Ready for the bond?" he asked carefully, giving her space to clarify or retreat from the statement if she wished. "Yes," Ren said, her voice steadier now that the decision had settled fully within her heart. "I have spent weeks weighing my fear against everything you have shown me since that first morning at the storehouse. I do not want fear to keep me from choosing something that feels genuinely right, simply because trusting fully still frightens me." "Ren," Ronan said softly, reaching to take her hands gently within his own, "I need you to be completely certain. This is not a decision to make out of gratitude for my protection, or out of fear regarding Dorian's continued threats. This must be a decision made purely because it is what you want for yourself." "It is," Ren said firmly, meeting his gaze directly despite the vulnerability of the moment. "I want this, Ronan. Not because you saved me from punishment, not because you have protected me from Dorian, but because these past weeks with you have shown me a version of myself I had forgotten existed, someone worthy of care, worthy of genuine partnership, rather than simply worthy of survival." Ronan's expression softened with visible emotion, his golden eyes reflecting the same fierce warmth Ren had come to associate with his quiet, steady presence. "Then I accept," he said softly, "fully, completely, and without hesitation." The bond formed between them that evening beneath the quiet darkness of the Healing Quarters garden. A connection neither fully understood in its complexity, but both recognized immediately in its rightness. Ren felt something settle deep within her chest, a warmth and steadiness she had not experienced since long before her parents' deaths, since before exile and hunger had taught her to expect nothing but hardship from the world around her. In the days following the bond's formation, Ren noticed subtle changes within herself. An awareness of Ronan's presence even when they were not physically together, a steadiness in her own confidence that had not existed before. She moved through the compound with newfound assurance, her earlier hesitance around pack members gradually replaced by genuine belonging. Even Garrick, who had remained openly skeptical of her presence since her arrival, softened somewhat in his interactions with her, though he remained cautious regarding the ongoing threat from Ashgrove. "The bond changes things," Beatrice explained one afternoon, as Ren assisted with healing duties. "Word will spread quickly now, both within our pack and beyond. Dorian will learn of it soon, if he has not already through his own sources. Do you believe it will make things worse?" Ren asked, concern flickering through her newfound confidence. "Perhaps initially," Beatrice admitted honestly. "A completed bond between an Alpha King and a claimed Omega carries significant political weight. Dorian's claim over you becomes considerably weaker once such a bond is publicly recognized." Ren considered this carefully, understanding the implications clearly. If Dorian had hoped to reclaim her through political pressure and legal technicalities, a completed bond with Ronan would strip away much of his leverage entirely. But she also understood, with the same clarity, that Dorian was not a man likely to accept defeat gracefully, regardless of how thoroughly his claims had been undermined. That understanding proved correct only days later, when Halden arrived at the Healing Quarters with urgent news that immediately shattered the fragile peace Ren had begun to enjoy. "Scouts have spotted Ashgrove wolves moving along our eastern border," Halden reported grimly to Ronan, who had arrived moments earlier to check on Ren's progress. "Not a small formation. This looks like preparation for something considerably more aggressive than another diplomatic visit." Ronan's expression hardened immediately. The warmth that had softened his features moments earlier, replaced instantly by fierce, calculated focus. "How many?" he demanded. "Enough to suggest Dorian intends to test our defenses directly, rather than simply threaten through words alone," Halden replied. Ren's stomach dropped at the news, old fear resurfacing alongside a fierce protectiveness for the pack that had become her home over the past weeks. "What does this mean?" she asked, though she suspected the answer clearly enough. "It means Dorian has decided words and legal claims are no longer sufficient," Ronan said grimly. "He intends to attempt reclaiming you through force, regardless of the bond now connecting us." "He would risk open conflict between territories over this?" Ren asked, disbelief and fear mingling in her voice. "Pride and cruelty often outweigh careful judgment in men like Dorian," Ronan replied. He has already shown willingness to allow innocent deaths and force unwanted arrangements to protect his reputation and his son's desires. Open conflict is simply the next escalation in a pattern he has followed for years. Ren's hands trembled slightly, fear and determination warring within her chest in equal measure. She had spent months running from exactly this kind of confrontation, and now, standing within the safety of the Blackthorn compound, she found herself facing it directly regardless of how far she had run. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice steadier than the fear coursing through her body. Ronan's expression shifted, fierce determination replacing the grim concern that had colored his features moments earlier. "We prepare," he said firmly, "and we ensure Dorian understands clearly that any attempt to reclaim you through force will be met with consequences he is not prepared to face." As Halden departed to relay further instructions to the gathered guards, Ronan turned to Ren, taking her hands gently within his own, despite the tension gripping the compound. "Whatever happens next," he said softly, "know that this pack, and everyone within it, stands united in protecting what we have built together. You are not facing this alone, Ren. You never will again." Ren nodded, drawing strength from his steady conviction despite the fear still coiling tight within her chest. The peaceful weeks she had enjoyed within the Blackthorn compound were coming to an abrupt end, replaced now by the looming certainty of confrontation with the pack that had once cast her aside as worthless. But standing beside Ronan, bonded now in a connection neither Dorian nor anyone else could easily undo, Ren found herself facing the coming storm with far more courage than she ever believed herself capable of possessing. Torches lined the eastern wall of the Blackthorn compound that night, casting long, flickering shadows across the gathered guards who stood in tense formation, watching the tree line for any sign of movement. Ren stood near the healing quarters entrance with Beatrice, supplies already prepared in case the coming hours brought injuries requiring immediate attention. "You should be further inside the compound," Beatrice said gently, noticing Ren's tense posture as she watched the distant tree line. "If conflict reaches this close to the walls, you would be safer away from the front lines entirely." "I cannot hide while others fight because of me," Ren replied firmly, though fear tightened uncomfortably in her chest. "If injuries come from this confrontation, I want to help however I can." Beatrice studied her for a long moment before nodding, understanding the fierce determination behind Ren's words even if she still worried for her safety. Near the main gate, Ronan stood with Halden and Garrick, reviewing final preparations before whatever confrontation the night might bring. Scouts had confirmed the Ashgrove formation continued moving steadily toward the border, their numbers significant enough to suggest genuine intent to force entry rather than simply intimidate through presence alone. "Dorian grows bold," Garrick muttered, his earlier skepticism regarding Ren's presence within the pack now entirely overshadowed by concern for the compound's safety. "This goes beyond a simple claim over an Omega. This is a direct challenge to your authority as Alpha." "Then we will answer that challenge clearly," Ronan replied, his voice hard with resolve. "Dorian believes cruelty and force can achieve whatever legal claims and diplomatic pressure failed to accomplish. He is about to learn how mistaken that belief truly is." The first sign of the approaching formation appeared just after midnight, torchlight flickering through the distant trees as Ashgrove wolves emerged from the forest edge, their numbers substantial enough to send a visible ripple of tension through the gathered Blackthorn guards. Alpha Dorian rode at the front of the formation, his expression cold and determined in the flickering torchlight as he brought his wolves to a halt just beyond the tree line, close enough to be clearly visible but far enough to avoid immediate confrontation at the wall itself. "Alpha Blackthorn," Dorian called out, his voice carrying easily across the tense distance between the two formations. "I have given you ample opportunity to reconsider your position regarding my claim. Your continued refusal leaves me no choice but to reclaim what belongs to my pack through more direct means." "You have no legitimate claim remaining," Ronan called back, his voice steady and unwavering despite the tension coiling through the compound. "Ren is bonded to me now, fully and completely. Whatever authority you once believed you held over her ended the moment she fled circumstances your own pack created through cruelty and neglect." Dorian's expression darkened at the confirmation of the bond, fury visible even from the distance separating the two formations. "A bond formed under circumstances of manipulation and desperation holds questionable legitimacy," he shouted back. "I do not recognize its validity, nor do I intend to allow it to stand unchallenged." "Your recognition is not required for the bond's legitimacy," Ronan replied firmly. "It exists regardless of your acceptance, and I will defend it, along with Ren's safety, through whatever means become necessary tonight." The tension between the two formations stretched taut as a drawn bowstring, both sides waiting for the first move that would determine whether this confrontation remained a standoff or escalated into genuine conflict. Ren watched from the healing quarters entrance, her heart pounding as she recognized the very real possibility of violence breaking out between the two territories because of circumstances entirely beyond her control. "I cannot simply wait here while this unfolds," she said suddenly, moving toward the main gate despite Beatrice's immediate protest. "Ren, it is not safe." "I need to speak for myself," Ren interrupted, already moving with determined steps toward the confrontation building at the gate. "I have hidden and run for too long. If Dorian intends to use my fate as justification for conflict, I want him to hear directly from me exactly why his claim holds no truth." She reached the gate just as tension between the two formations seemed ready to break into open conflict. Guards on both sides tensed and ready for whatever command their leaders might give. Ronan's eyes widened slightly as he noticed her approaching, though he made no move to send her away, understanding the fierce determination written clearly across her expression. "Alpha Dorian," Ren called out, her voice carrying clearly across the tense space between formations, steadier than she expected given the fear still coursing through her body. "You speak of legitimate claims and pack obligations, yet you conveniently ignore the circumstances that drove me from your territory in the first place." Dorian's cold eyes fixed on her, fury and something almost desperate flickering behind his controlled expression. "This is not your place to speak, girl. Matters of pack law are decided by alphas, not by unclaimed omegas who abandoned their obligations." "I am no longer unclaimed," Ren replied firmly. "And whatever obligations you believe I owe your pack ended the moment your leadership failed to protect my parents, failed to protect me, and instead sought to force me into circumstances I never consented to accept." Murmurs rippled through the gathered wolves on both sides, several Ashgrove guards exchanging uncertain glances at Ren's bold declaration. Dorian's expression tightened further, clearly recognizing the shift in perception happening even among his own formation. "You dare speak such accusations publicly?" Dorian demanded, his voice rising with barely controlled fury. "I dare speak the truth," Ren replied, her voice unwavering despite the intensity of the confrontation. "You allowed my parents' deaths to go unquestioned, because investigating too closely might have revealed your own son's involvement in circumstances leading to those deaths. You intended to force me into an arrangement with him despite my clear unwillingness, and only my escape prevented that outcome." "Lies," Dorian snarled, though something in his expression suggested Ren's accusations landed closer to truth than he wanted his own guards to recognize. "Are they lies?" Ronan interjected sharply, stepping forward beside Ren with fierce protectiveness evident in every line of his posture. "Or is it simply inconvenient truth that undermines whatever justification you have constructed for tonight's aggression?" Dorian's jaw clenched tight, his cold composure finally cracking under the combined pressure of Ren's public accusations and Ronan's unwavering support. He glanced briefly at his own formation, noting the uncertainty rippling visibly through several of his guards at the accusations now hanging heavy in the air between the two territories. "This confrontation was never meant to become a public airing of unproven accusations," Dorian said finally, his voice tighter than before, clearly recognizing the shifting dynamics of the standoff. "Then perhaps it should have," Ronan replied firmly. "Perhaps your guards deserve to understand exactly what kind of leadership they are being asked to risk their lives defending tonight. A leadership built on cruelty toward a grieving orphan, and an attempt to reclaim her through force after failing through legal means and diplomatic pressure." The tension stretching between the two formations shifted palpably, several Ashgrove guards exchanging uncertain glances, clearly reconsidering their willingness to engage in open conflict over a claim now revealed publicly as built on cruelty rather than legitimate pack law. Dorian recognized the shift as well, fury and calculation warring visibly behind his cold expression, as he studied the wavering resolve within his own formation. Whatever plan he had carried into tonight's confrontation was clearly unraveling beneath the weight of publicly exposed truth. "This is not finished," Dorian said finally, his voice tight with barely controlled fury as he turned his horse away from the tense standoff at the gate. "But perhaps tonight is not the appropriate moment for its resolution." He gave a sharp signal to his formation, and slowly, with visible reluctance from several guards, the Ashgrove wolves began retreating back toward the tree line, the immediate threat of conflict dissolving beneath the weight of Ren's public testimony and Ronan's unwavering support. Ren watched them retreat, relief and exhaustion flooding through her body in equal measure, as the tension of the confrontation finally began releasing its tight grip on her chest. Beside her, Ronan let out a slow breath, though his expression remained watchful, clearly recognizing that tonight's retreat did not guarantee permanent resolution to the conflict. "You were remarkable," he said softly, turning to face her fully, once the Ash Grove formation had disappeared entirely into the darkness beyond the tree line. "I was terrified," Ren admitted, her hands finally beginning to tremble now that the immediate danger had passed. "Terrified and remarkable are not mutually exclusive," Ronan said gently, pulling her carefully into his arms as the adrenaline of the confrontation slowly began fading from her body. "You stood before an alpha who caused you tremendous suffering and spoke truth despite every reason to remain silent and hidden. That takes courage few possess." Ren allowed herself to rest against him, drawing comfort from his steady warmth after the intensity of the night's confrontation. Around them, the gathered Blackthorn guards slowly began relaxing their tense formation, murmurs of relief and admiration rippling through the crowd at the successful resolution of tonight's threat. But even as relief settled over the compound, Ren understood clearly that Dorian's retreat tonight did not guarantee permanent peace. His cold, calculating expression as he turned away suggested a man reconsidering strategy, rather than accepting defeat entirely. Whatever conflict remained unresolved between their territories would likely resurface again, in some form, before true resolution could finally be achieved. For tonight, however, she allowed herself to feel the fierce relief of having stood her ground, of having spoken truth against the cruelty that had shaped so much of her painful past, and of having done so beside someone who had proven, time and again, that his protection and care extended far beyond simple duty, into something genuine and unwavering. Word of the confrontation at the eastern wall spread rapidly beyond the Blackthorn territory in the days that followed, carried by traveling merchants and messengers between packs across the northern regions. Ren learned of its reach when Garrick approached her directly one morning, an expression on his face far different from the skepticism he had shown her since her arrival. "Neighboring packs have begun questioning Alpha Dorian's conduct," Garrick said, his tone carrying grudging respect he had not previously extended toward her. "Your public account of the circumstances surrounding your parents' deaths has drawn scrutiny he clearly did not anticipate. I did not speak that night hoping to damage his reputation," Ren said honestly. "I simply could not remain silent any longer." "Sometimes truth accomplishes what careful strategy cannot," Garrick replied. "Several neighboring alphas have sent inquiries requesting more detailed accounts of what transpired within Ash Grove territory before your exile. It seems your courage that night opened doors toward accountability that many believed permanently closed." Ren absorbed this information carefully, uncertain how to feel about the wider implications of her public testimony. She had spoken to defend herself and challenge Dorian's claim, not fully anticipating the broader consequences her words might carry across neighboring territories. "What does this mean for Ash Grove?" she asked. "It means Dorian's authority faces scrutiny he has not previously encountered," Garrick explained. "Alphas maintain power partially through the perception of just and fair leadership. Public accusations of cruelty toward a grieving orphan, followed by an attempted forceful reclamation after failed legal and diplomatic efforts, paint a picture few neighboring packs view favorably." Ren considered this, a complicated mixture of vindication and lingering unease settling within her chest. She had spent months believing herself powerless against Dorian's authority, and now, standing within the safety of the Blackthorn compound, she found herself somehow at the center of consequences reaching far beyond anything she had anticipated. That afternoon, Ronan called her to the private study where he often conducted matters requiring careful discretion. He looked tired but satisfied, several letters spread across his desk bearing seals from unfamiliar packs. "These arrived this morning," he explained, gesturing toward the letters. "Formal inquiries from 3 separate territories requesting clarification regarding the confrontation at our eastern wall, along with the accusations you made publicly against Alpha Dorian. Should I be concerned?" Ren asked carefully. "Quite the opposite," Ronan said, a small smile finally breaking through his exhausted expression. "These inquiries suggest growing support for formal investigation into Dorian's conduct, both regarding your parents' deaths and his recent attempt at forceful reclamation. Several alphas have expressed willingness to support formal proceedings against him if evidence supports your accusations." Ren's heart pounded at the possibility of genuine accountability finally reaching Alpha Dorian after months of believing such justice entirely impossible. "Do you believe such proceedings could actually happen?" she asked. "I believe your courage that night created an opening few expected," Ronan said honestly. "Dorian has ruled through fear and calculated cruelty for years, but public accountability changes calculations considerably. If neighboring packs unite in demanding formal investigation, even his authority may not withstand the scrutiny." Over the following weeks, formal proceedings slowly began taking shape, coordinated between several northern territories concerned by the accusations against Alpha Dorian. Ren found herself called upon multiple times to provide detailed testimony regarding the circumstances of her parents' deaths and her subsequent exile, each retelling difficult but somehow less overwhelming than she expected, bolstered by Ronan's steady presence beside her throughout the process. Evidence gradually accumulated beyond her testimony alone. Former Ashgrove Pack members, emboldened by the public scrutiny, came forward with additional accounts corroborating patterns of cruelty and manipulation within Dorian's leadership. What began as Ren's desperate defense against a single unjust claim slowly transformed into a broader reckoning against years of unchecked abuse of power. "I never imagined this outcome," Ren admitted one evening, as she and Ronan walked together through the quiet gardens behind the healing quarters, the formal proceedings against Dorian, now scheduled for review before a council of neighboring alphas. "I only wanted to survive, to escape circumstances that terrified me. I never expected my survival might eventually contribute to genuine justice." "Sometimes survival itself becomes an act of quiet resistance," Ronan said gently. "Your refusal to simply disappear, to accept whatever fate Dorian intended for you, created ripples neither of us could have fully predicted that morning at the storehouse." Ren smiled softly at the memory. The desperate, starving young woman who had stolen 2 strips of dried meat feeling impossibly distant from who she had become over the past months. "Do you ever regret that morning?" she asked, only half teasing. "Sparing a thief who ended up entangling you in conflict with a neighboring pack?" "Never," Ronan said immediately, his tone carrying no hesitation whatsoever. "That morning gave me you, Ren. Whatever complications followed, I would make the same choice again without a moment's doubt." Ren leaned against him, grateful for the steady warmth of his presence after months of uncertainty and fear. The formal council proceedings loomed ahead, uncertain in their eventual outcome, but she no longer faced that uncertainty entirely alone, surrounded now by a pack that had welcomed her, a bond that anchored her, and an alpha king whose protection had proven genuine time and again since that first desperate morning near the storehouse. The council convened 3 weeks later in neutral territory, gathering alphas from across the northern regions to review the substantial evidence accumulated against Dorian Ashgrove. Ren stood before the assembled council, Ronan steady beside her, and delivered her testimony one final time, her voice clear and unwavering despite the weight of the moment. The council's deliberation stretched through the remainder of the day, tension building steadily, as Ren waited alongside Ronan for their final judgment. When the council finally emerged with their decision, the verdict confirmed what months of accumulated evidence had strongly suggested. Dorian Ashgrove was formally stripped of his authority, his territory placed under interim leadership, while a proper successor could be determined, and his son barred permanently from any future position of pack authority, given the credible accusations against his conduct. Relief and vindication flooded through Ren as the council's judgment was announced, months of fear and uncertainty finally giving way to genuine, hard-won justice. Ronan's hand found hers immediately, his grip steady and reassuring, as the weight of the moment settled fully between them. "It is finished," he said quietly, though his eyes carried the same relief evident in Ren's own expression. "It is finished," Ren repeated, allowing herself finally to release the tension she had carried since that first messenger arrived at the Blackthorn gates weeks earlier. As they traveled back toward the Blackthorn compound that evening, the weight of justice finally achieved settling comfortably around them. Ren found herself reflecting on the impossible distance she had traveled since that desperate morning near the storehouse. She had arrived at the Blackthorn territory starving, alone, and convinced of her own worthlessness. She now returned as someone bonded to an alpha king, respected by an entire pack, and finally free of the shadow that had haunted her for months. The road ahead remained uncertain in many ways, filled with new responsibilities and challenges as Ronan's bonded partner and eventual Luna. But for the first time since her parents' deaths, Ren faced that uncertain future, without the crushing fear that had defined so much of her recent past. Instead, she faced it with quiet confidence, steady hope, and the unwavering support of someone who had chosen her, fully and completely, from that very first desperate morning, when hunger had driven her to steal 2 strips of meat from an Alpha King's storehouse. The great hall of the Blackthorn compound had never looked so full of light. Banners hung fresh along the stone walls, and every corner of the room carried the warm scent of festival food prepared for the celebration that had drawn pack members from every corner of the territory. Ren stood near the entrance, smoothing the soft fabric of her gown with hands that trembled slightly, though this time from anticipation rather than fear. "You look beautiful," Ivy said, adjusting a small braid in Ren's hair with careful hands. "I still remember the first day you arrived here, barely able to stand from exhaustion. Look how far you have come. Ren smiled, memories of that desperate morning near the storehouse feeling like they belonged to an entirely different lifetime. I could not have imagined this outcome, she admitted honestly. Not in my most hopeful moments during those months of exile. Ronan certainly imagined it, Beatrice said, appearing beside them with a knowing smile. I have never seen him look at anyone the way he looks at you, not in all my years serving this pack. Ren's cheeks warmed at the observation, though she could not deny the truth behind it. The weeks following Dorian's formal removal from power had passed quickly, filled with careful preparation for today's ceremony. The official recognition of her position as Ronan's Luna, before the entire gathered pack and several visiting dignitaries from neighboring territories. Halden appeared at the doorway, offering a respectful nod toward Ren, the wariness that had once defined his interactions with her, long since replaced by genuine respect. The Alpha awaits you, he said simply. Ren took a steadying breath, gratitude and quiet joy settling deep within her chest as she walked through the great hall's entrance, the assembled crowd falling silent as she approached the raised platform where Ronan stood waiting, dressed in formal attire that somehow made his presence even more commanding than usual. His golden eyes found hers immediately, warmth and pride evident in every line of his expression as she approached. She climbed the steps toward him, her hand finding his the moment she reached the platform, steady and familiar despite the formality of the occasion. Pack members of Blackthorn, Ronan announced, his voice carrying easily through the silent hall, and honored guests from neighboring territories. I stand before you today to formally recognize what has already been true within my heart for many months now. He turned to face Ren fully, his expression softening with genuine emotion despite the formal setting. This woman arrived within our territory, starving, alone, and believing herself worthless in the eyes of the world. She has proven, time and again, through quiet resilience, fierce courage, and unwavering honesty, that she is worth more than any political alliance or careful calculation could ever measure. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the assembled crowd, many of whom had witnessed firsthand Ren's transformation from cautious stranger to respected member of their pack over the preceding months. Today, Ronan continued, I formally declare Ren as my bonded partner and Luna of the Blackthorn territory, recognized fully before this pack and all who bear witness to this ceremony. The crowd erupted into cheers and applause. The formal recognition met with genuine warmth rather than the reluctant acceptance Ren had once feared might greet such an announcement. She scanned the crowd briefly, finding Ivy beaming with pride, Beatrice wiping away a happy tear, and even Garrick offering a respectful nod that carried none of his earlier skepticism. Ren, Ronan said quietly, drawing her attention back to him, as the crowd's celebration continued around them. Do you accept this position, fully and completely, alongside everything it entails? I do, Ren said, her voice steady despite the emotion swelling within her chest. Fully, and without hesitation. The formal ceremony concluded with traditional customs Ren had learned over recent weeks, symbolic gestures marking her official position as Luna before the assembled pack. When the formalities finally ended, giving way to genuine celebration, Ronan pulled her gently aside, away from the immediate press of well-wishers, his expression softening into something far more personal than the formal declarations moments earlier. How do you feel? He asked softly. Overwhelmed, Ren admitted honestly, though genuine joy colored her tone rather than the anxiety such a feeling might once have carried. In the best possible way. I keep thinking about that morning at the storehouse, how certain I was that stealing those 2 strips of meat would end in punishment, perhaps even worse. Instead it led to this, Ronan said, gesturing toward the celebrating crowd, the warm hall, the life they had built together over the preceding months. Instead it led to this, Ren agreed, leaning gently against him as relief and happiness settled comfortably within her chest. Later that evening, as the celebration continued around them, Ren found herself standing near the same window where she had first watched Alpha Dorian's formation approach the compound weeks earlier. The memory no longer carried the same sharp fear it once had, replaced instead by quiet gratitude for how thoroughly that threat had ultimately been resolved. Ronan joined her there, his hand finding hers naturally, comfortably, the way it had come to feel over recent months. Regretting anything? He asked gently, noticing her thoughtful expression. Never, Ren said immediately, turning to face him fully. I regret the pain that brought me here, the loss of my parents, the months of fear and hunger, but I do not regret a single moment since that morning you found me at the storehouse. Nor do I, Ronan said softly, pulling her gently into his arms as the celebration continued warmly around them. Ren rested against him, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her cheek. Grateful beyond words for the impossible journey that had led her from starving exile to standing here, recognized fully as Luna, before an entire pack that had welcomed her as one of their own. The Alpha King who had once shown mercy to a desperate, starving thief, now stood beside her as partner, protector, and bonded mate, their fates woven together permanently through circumstances neither could have predicted that first desperate morning. And Ren, who had once believed herself worthless and forgotten by the world, finally understood that sometimes the greatest transformations begin with the smallest acts of mercy, offered freely by someone willing to look past circumstance and see genuine worth waiting patiently underneath. Outside the Great Hall, stars scattered brightly across the clear night sky above the Blackthorn territory, silent witnesses to a story that had begun with hunger and desperation, and now, finally, found its resolution in genuine belonging, unwavering partnership, and a home Ren had never dared imagine herself worthy of finding.